Hi, everybody. My name is Roy Kinsey. I'm here for the 22nd annual Poetry Fest featuring Nate Marshall. Nate Marshall is an award-winning author, editor, poet, playwright, performer, educator, speaker, and rapper. His book, Wild Hundreds, was honored with the Black Caucus of the American Library Association's Award for Poetry Book of the Year and the Great Lakes College Association's New Writer Award. He is also an editor of the Breakbeat Poets, New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop, and he also co-curates the Breakbeat Poets series for Haymarket Books. Marshall co-wrote the play No Blue Memories, The Life of Gwendolyn Brooks, with Eve Ewing, produced by Manual Cinema, a commission by the Poetry Foundation. He also wrote the audio drama Bro Rabbit and the fantastic telling of Remington Ellis, Esquire, which was produced by Make Believe Association. His last rap album, Grown, came out in 2015 with his group Daily Lyrical Product. His next book, Finna, is out now and is one of my most favorite pieces of literature. I really had a great time devouring it. I have some questions about it, but I'm really glad to be here with you, Nate. Nate Marshall is an experienced and versatile educator working with learners of all ages in both academic and community settings. He co-wrote Chicago Public Schools' first literary arts curriculum and develops lesson plans using creative writing to help participants discuss social justice, mental health, community development, and other topics pertinent to social science. He is an assistant professor of English at Colorado College. He previously served as the assistant director of Wabash College's Malcolm X Institute of Black Studies and the director of national programs at Young Chicago Authors. Marshall has taught in a number of traditional and community-based settings, including Wabash College, Young Chicago Authors, Northwestern University, Inside Out Literary Arts, and the University of Michigan. Nate Marshall, how we doing?
What's up, Roy? Ooh, here we go.
It's
so good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fantastic. I'm having an amazing time, an amazing life. You know, I'm blessed, black, and highly favored, as Charlemagne the God would say.
All right.
Shall we jump right in?
Yeah. So I guess you want me to read first, and then we'll sort of talk.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, please.
All right. Wonderful. Greetings, everyone out there in digital space. All right. I am gonna read some poems, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation. Let me think. I guess I'll start here today. This poem is called Conceal. I've been thinking about this poem a lot. I guess the thing you should know is, so this poem was, I initially wrote it after listening to an interview with Tamir. It was Tamir Rice's grandmother, right? So Tamir Rice, for those who maybe don't remember, was the young man, he was like 12 or 13 and was murdered by the police in Cleveland. And he had like a toy gun, which always struck me, particularly the thing that his grandmother said, which is that he wasn't allowed to play with toy guns. So this poem is called Conceal. Grandma, who kept books for a living and read corner store romance novels. Grandma, who kept dictionaries on the kitchen table and slurred words into contraction. Grandma, who taught me how to pass a poll test and how to beat a draft exam. Grandma, who told me to study hard and leave school if the MBA was an option. Grandma, who bought Black and called us her little niggas with a smirk. Grandma, who taught me how to shoot a bank shot and told me to quit the team if I rode bench. Grandma, who paid for cars and cash and gambled herself broke on weekends. Grandma, who hid toy guns I got as gifts, and when she passed, I pulled a real shotgun from the wall of her closet. Cool. All right, let's see. All right, this is the first poem in the book. Certainly, like, I think the process or the tradition of like offering land acknowledgements has become kind of more common over the last number of years, and this poem, I think, is kind of in that tradition of thinking about that tradition. It's called Landless Acknowledgement.
I love that piece, and I think that this is always really interesting how these
Yeah.
kind of unfold. And I know that we were gonna save the Q&A for like
No, we're good. We're good.
but I'm
We're
like,
good.
can we like talk? Can we kind
Yeah,
of
let's
like
do it.
talk about the poems? Let's just do a kind of a mashup because I want to
Yeah.
kind of pick apart a little bit, and those aren't the right words, but I know that family is so central. You love your grandma like I loved my grandma. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I think that's
Yeah.
one of the many places where we really relate. And I'd like to talk about that piece and what, you know,
Sure.
drove you to write that piece. I remember having a toy gun actually, and coming home, and it was on. I I had it under my mattress, and I came home one day, and it was on the kitchen table, and we had to have a talk about it. The family had to have a talk about this gun
Sure.
that looked real, and I'm just, really wanting to know the story behind the poem, but also your relationship, with your grandmother and why it's so important for you to include family in your creative process.
Yeah, that's real. So I guess in terms of that poem specifically, right? Um, I think that there are a lot of sort of like cultural hangups, hand-me-downs, traditions, ways of being that happen in Black communities and in like Black American households. And one thing I think that's been interesting for me as I grow up has been to observe those things or really like learn that they exist, right? Because the thing is like, the way you grow up is the way you grow up, and you don't necessarily think of any part of it as particular until you get other visions of how the world might exist, right? Um, and so, when I heard this is years ago at this point, but when I heard this interview with Tamir Rice's grandmother, it really struck me because I was like, oh snap, like his grandma didn't allow him to play with toy guns. He was playing with this gun. That's like how he gets killed by the police, right? And obviously, like, that's heartbreaking, that's terrible, it's all of these things. But it also struck me that like that he was effectively killed for breaking a rule in his household, right? And a rule that really exists in his household to keep him safe, right? Because I think his grandmother seems like has a sort of understanding about like the kinds of relationships to violence that Black boys may have, right? Whether or not they want that, whether or not they invite that, right? And so Black boys don't get to say like play cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians, whatever sort of like pedantic sort of all-American version of that game in the way that like boys of other races or kids of other races might get, right? And so that I just was thinking a lot about that as I wrote that poem. And I guess to the kind of second part of your question about family broadly, for me, one, my grandma was just like really an important figure in my life. Like, she was a librarian. She was someone who really encouraged me to become a reader, to become, you know, to like did I don't want to say she like encouraged me to become a poet, but she certainly, I think, laid much of the groundwork
Sure.
for that, right? Whether or not she knew that's what she was doing. And so she always comes up in my writing, but I also think like, you know, for me, writing is many things, but one of the things that it is a way to like understand how to meet the world. And, you know, like many people, the first world that I know is my family. And so, um, you know, I'm trying to meet that world and trying to understand it better, and both like celebrate it and challenge it where I think where challenge is warranted. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's always fascinating you know, what could come out of a life when you're just surrounded by words and surrounded by books and surrounded by literature.
Yeah.
And then you get somebody like Nate Marshall, who is like poet, rapper extraordinaire, you know, contributing to the canon. So we love you and your grandmother for it, for sure.
Thank you.
Um, if you are ready to read your next piece.
Yeah. 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 So I'll read Landless Acknowledgement, and we'll sort of go from
Yeah.
there. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that we live on some unceded bones. Sometimes me and mine imagine ancestral homes. All I got so far is Montgomery, Alabama. Maybe a boat, maybe a plot of land somewhere so far from the South Sides I've claimed that I would get lost on the way. I admit, sometimes my homies talk about their families immigrating and I get jealous. We lost the land we were custodians over before I was a twinkle in the eye of a twinkle in the eye of a twinkle in the eye. Closest I got to a homeland is my mama's Caucasian pitch on the phone calling the police. Closest I got to a homeland is not never calling the police. Closest I got to a homeland is my daddy's laugh in a spades game. Closest I got to a homeland is my lover's tongue, talking or otherwise. Closest I got to a homeland is the funk under a DJ's needle in my hand, full of a dance partner. Not to be dark, but I am. Not to be dark, but the planet is on fire. Not to be dark, but they move in capitals because the water is coming up. Not to be dark, but our bones are in that water too. Maybe that's my capital. Once the polar capitals melt and there's a whole lot less land for folks to buy and sell and steal, maybe everybody will feel a little more dark, will feel a little more homelandless like we do. Why you think I call my compatriots homies? Maybe ain't no home, except for how your beloveds cuss or pray or pronounce. Cool.
Mm. Come on, Nate Marshall, my favorite rapper. You know, I have a hard time calling myself a poet, but you have like bars, like this is bar supremacy here, right? Besides a beat and a rhyme, how and when do you know when your words want to be a verse, and when your words want to be like a verse?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think something that a poet once told me was that most most writers, if they're lucky, only really have two or three things that they are writing, and everything is just sort of a rewriting of that. Like you really are writing two poems in your life, right?
Wow.
And everything is just the reimagination of that thing. You know, I understand how that could be true. I think you could take issue with that if you wanted to, but there for me, I think there are things about that that ring really true, in that you know, I'm often like exploring similar things or asking similar questions regardless of the form that I'm working in, right? If I'm making music, or if I'm writing a poem or working on like a book of poems, or if I'm writing a play or writing something for audio or for stage or whatever. and I don't think that the kind of impulses change. The thing I think does change is I think about there being different meanings to things, um, or different kinds of meaning, right? So different layers of meaning, right? So there's like the what the words literally mean, right? Which I would call like the denotative meaning. Then there's the sort of connotative meaning, right? Which is the sort of impression the words give, right? So to say that you love something versus you have an obsession with something, it might communicate the same thought or the same action, but might communicate it with, with a different impression, right? One being more positive, one being more negative or more troubling, right? Then there's the meaning. There's the meaning at the level of sound, right? The sonic meaning, and then there's the meaning at the level of like shape or performance, right? And I think, and you're always playing with, or all those different meanings are always happening simultaneously or in concert and intention with each other. But for me, I would say like the difference between writing a rhyme versus just writing a poem is that which meanings are like I'm paying a little more attention to are dependent on the form, right? So like if I'm making music, then it has to, like the first thing I want to do is like make something that is sonically beautiful or interesting, or engaging in that way. And so that meaning, right? Like how I'm manipulating the language to create rhythms, to create melodies, to break apart melodies, to break apart rhythms is is a little more. I'm more attuned to that in that moment than I would be if I were writing like a poem. Even though that doesn't mean that the sound is unimportant in the poems, right? There's still all these moments of like sound play or dynamic stuff at the level of sound in a poem. It's just not like it's not the first order of business, right? It's like the second or third.
Yeah, yeah, definitely understood. Word, literally. um,
Shall
yeah,
keep
definitely.
reading?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
All right, let me see. What do I want to do? Yeah, I'll do this one. So, I grew up like uh, I went to magnet school for most of my time growing up, which was a really interesting experience. Certainly, like in a city as segregated as Chicago, and for me, one of the really cool or really dynamic, interesting parts of that space was that I think I'm relatively unique in that despite like being a kid who grew up in the city, being a kid that went to public school his whole life, I always like went to really quite diverse schools and had like pretty diverse sets of friends. Um, and so this poem is kind of about a kid who I encountered as a result of that. So this was a friend of a friend. Like I went over my homeboy Bart's house, and this is for this kid who I encountered in his neighborhood that was fairly different from my neighborhood. This is called Poem for Blackie.
Mm.
Blackie, your name so given after you called me Blackie in Bart's basement, and I slid a hard cue ball into your surprised white finger. I ask about you more than I do any of the other neighborhood kids, the ones who were nice to me or at least silent. I consider you more now than any of the girls down the block with their quick smiles and snapping necks, their fretful mothers peeking in the windows. My man Blackie, if we shook hands today, would your ring finger crook? Blackie, we ate kielbasa together and then beefed. Blackie, Blackie, Blackie. You, apology paid in pain, little reversal of racism, small justice of wrath, my middle school jubilee, my first tiny reparation.
Mm.
Cool.
Mm.
Now I always think I think about I think about you when I read that one because the album, right? Because obviously,
Yeah.
right, your album Black.
Yeah. I just think that I don't even know where to go from that actually. I feel resolved, but also just like exploring that, right? I was at a really interesting time when I was revisiting that moment in my life of wanting to even name the album Blackie, wanting to, recover that memory. Um, there's also a poem, I don't know if you planned on reading it, but it's called The Nigger Joke. Um, and that one kind of just like melted me when I read it. And I want to know where, what inspired it. And also kind of just thinking about the courage that you have to have as a poet, as a writer, to like put these things out there because, I've watched them. I don't know if you've seen I don't know if you've seen them yet.
I haven't checked it yet. No.
Yeah, crazy. But thinking about these different dynamics of like inhabiting a Black body and moving around the world in it and having these experiences. And so I really just kind of want to know the inspiration, the story behind the nigger joke. And then if you ever, if you feel inclined to speak on something larger about the courage of including these moments in your work, I'd love to hear, just hear your thoughts about it.
Sure. Yeah. So so Nigger Joke is like one of the sort of earlier poems in the book. Um, and I guess there's a few things, or maybe a few things that are like helpful to name. One thing for me is like I'm always just as a poet and I think just as like a fan of art, I've always been fascinated by comedy, right? Um, for a bunch of reasons, right? One, because I think comedy is like one of the it's so revealing, like what we think is funny or not funny, what we think is okay or even useful to make a joke about versus what is sort of out of bounds for that. Um, and so I've always been really fascinated by humor broadly and specifically by just like the ways that Black people and Black communities are like using humor as a way to like both connect and fortify and do all of these different things. And how much of like the American and arguably like maybe even this is broader than just the US, but like how much of our sort of the history of comedy is about sort of uh, the Black person as the sort of perpetual joke, right? As the kind of butt of the joke. Like you can't have any thoughtful conversation about the history of American entertainment without talking about the minstrel show. Like it just really is in so many ways like the Big Bang moment of American entertainment, which has come to dominate the global cultural landscape, right? So because of that, right, I often write these poems that one have little jokes in them to me, two borrow structure from jokes or that include jokes, right, that have some relationship to humor. Also, I just like think sort of stand-up comics are like the most fascinating artists. So that's kind of in the background of like of this poem and the book's kind of engagement with humor. The other thing too that I guess is a part of it is I am like not in my head, I'm like a very fun-loving and like relatively lighthearted person. And I realize that I often find myself in a position in the art space of like writing about and thinking about very serious things, which is important and which is like good and also a part of me. But like even when I'm dealing with those things, it doesn't like make me not like like a funny part. You know, it doesn't make me not want to like get a joke off, you know what I mean? And so I'm always like balancing those things. But I guess I'll read nigga jokes since that came up. I haven't read this in a minute. Huh. All right. Also, if you are like sensitive to such a thing, this poem uses the N-word a lot, which is perhaps, I mean, maybe you should know that from the title, but I don't know. God bless if you got to hit me. Come back in like a minute and a half and we'll keep talking. All right, nigga joke. So this nigga walks into a bar in this gentrifying neighborhood and orders fried chicken. And the nigger gets a craft beer because the nigger went to graduate school. And the nigger is waiting for his fried chicken. And this white man walks up and sits down in front of a half-drunk tall boy and calls the nigger's phone a big ass phone. And the nigger laughs because the phone is big and bought for with his graduate school money. And the nigger keeps his eyes up at the football game, and the white man extends his hand, and the nigger takes it with Kool-Aid strained cheeks because the nigger thinks about this week and all the wrong that white people have done, and maybe this is a start of a different story, and maybe the white man will tell him something honest over the liquor and buy him drinks. So the white man asks the nigger if he knows the neighborhood, but the nigger is new around here. So the white man says, welcome, and assures the nigger, this is a good bar. The white man talks about how he's here most nights and has never seen a fight. And he talks about how whites and niggers and Latinos drink in peace, and talks about the last 10 years and the buildings he bought a decade ago that are multiplying his pockets. And the white man talks about his Catholic school past, and the white man talks about making a corridor from downtown to the suburbs, and he's waiting for the other shoe to drop always and cop more buildings and get more rents. And he asks the nigger where he's from, and the nigger says South Side. And the white man tells the nigger what South Side is. And the white man talks about cop blocks and assures the nigger all of South Side isn't a wasteland because there's cop blocks over there too. And the nigger tries to shift the conversation to the South Side white neighborhoods because the nigger went to elementary school in one. And the white man talks about those cousins he has there and how they are on an island and how the South Side is so bad, but not where the white folks live. And the nigger tries the college town he lived in. And the white man's dad went to school there, and the white man got in, but the white man's dad wouldn't pay for that school even on his judge salary. So the white man went military academy instead. And the white man got cop brothers and other family. And the white man talks about his second house in the state of the college town and how up there he's a Catholic, and the not Catholic white men look at him different when they find out. And then the white man says, I've never been oppressed except one time. And he says, in Virginia, everybody's a nigger. And the white man says nothing. The nigger eats his chicken, which got there a while ago, and listens to the nigger joke. And the nigger joke says nothing and looks at the football game. And the white man says, pardon me if saying the nigger word offends you, but the nigger joke just nods, and the nigger joke waits for the white man to finish his story, and the nigger joke eats his chicken with a singular focus and hopes the bone plunges into his throat, and the nigger joke isn't hungry and can't stop eating as fast as possible. And the nigger joke hopes the white man talks about the protesters who are probably college students who should probably protest college tuition and not cops doing their jobs. But the nigger joke isn't listening. The nigger joke is repeating the prayer his mama taught him, and the prayer starts with the good elementary school, and then the good high school, and then the excellent college, and then the incredible graduate school, and how it was all merit scholarship, and also the high test scores, including the awards and honors, of course, the publications and acclaim. And the nigger joke finishes his prayer, and the nigger joke sees somebody's prayer answered when the nigger joke pays the waitress and tells the white man, have a good night, and cries the walk home.
Mm. You see what I'm saying? I read it. I'm like, oh my God. Just brilliant because, going to school at DePaul, I felt similar things plenty of times. When and why does he become the nigger joke in this poem?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always think about like I had like I said I hadn't read that poem in a while, even though I've been doing readings, and so I thought about like that shift, like that like volta, if you will, where the sort of the main character goes from being called the nigger to being called the nigger joke. I guess on a practical level, right? He becomes the joke when he doesn't respond, or when like the white guy makes this joke, right? And sort of like places this card on the table that is maybe been there the whole time, but like that kind of brazen acknowledgement means like, okay, now this is what this interaction is about, right? And I guess like I don't know. I guess like one of the things that I think a lot about is how how foundational like Black people have to be to our understanding of American humor, both as like innovative practitioners like Moms Mabley and Red Fox and Richard Pryor and also as the butt of the joke, right? Like so much of like I talked about the minstrel show as the kind of big bang of American entertainment, right? And I stand by that. And so I think that this has kind of put Black people in a sort of sticky wicket in this country, right? And particularly like in the 20th century and beyond, to where we're always having to contend with what it might mean to be the butt of the joke, right? To become the joke, right? And so like the thing about that is like it really colors so much of the Black experience, I think, in America, right? Like when you think about people that are really deeply invested in a certain kind of respectability, right? Part like that is in no small part motivated by like the desire to not be made a joke of, right? Which I really understand. I share that kind of feeling, and also when you look at people that are like become like really radicalized in their politics, right? Or really or whatever, right? That also it's a similar impulse to like not want to be made a joke of, right? Because like like take an institution like the Black Panthers in the 60s and like early 70s, like they are many things, but what they are not is funny. Like those folks are dead serious, right? And people take them as such, and that is part of why that is a cultural movement that has such a resonance and such a power with people, right? And so I guess like I'm kind of playing with that, right? And I'm kind of playing with like just the impossibility of that, right? Like the impossibility of not becoming the joke, as it were, in this society, and like and just thinking about the sort of the paradox of that, right? Because the thing about like if I could talk about like the action of that poem, one of the things about the poem is like the main character the whole time, and I can say like this is a poem that's like autobiographical, like this is a thing that happened to me in a bar, but like the whole time that's happening, I'm not trying to like clap back at this dude or get into an argument with him. Really, all I want is him to not fucking talk to me, right? Like that is like my deepest desire in that moment. That's the main character's deepest desire in that moment. But it's impossible, right? Like the dude cannot help himself but make a joke of the Black person, right? That is so much of like, I mean, that just seems to me like a deeply American impulse. Is like It's like, even when he knows like he probably shouldn't say anything, I didn't come with him, I'm not leaving with him, we don't know each other from Adam. There, like, you have food and drink and TV and everything to distract you. You cannot help but make a joke, like make the nigger into the nigger joke.
It's so wild. I mean, you just said so much, but it literally is like, it reminds me of when James Baldwin would say, you know, as an American, I want what you want, and that's to be left alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's literally to just be like left alone. But then you come over here, engage me in this kind of conversation, and what I knew was going to happen happened. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the wildest thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for reading that poem.
No, it's all good.
Thank you for writing that poem, first of all, but thank you for reading that poem. Have you ever been asked, this is from one of our viewers, have you ever been asked to not recite a particular poem at an event? And if
Oh,
so, how did you respond?
that's a really good question. Honestly, one of the first times that I recited a poem in public, I was in like maybe 8th grade, and I got in trouble for it. I like literally like it was some sort of like open mic or like arts night at our school, and my assistant principal, who now is like very high up in CPS. Shout out, what's up, Miss McDay? Like, she's cool. We like are good now. But she literally like pulled me off stage. Like I like unplugged the mic and like had to like then walk directly to her office off the stage. I like didn't finish the poem. That I think was like probably kind of traumatizing for me in some ways, but it also like I don't know, it kind of in some ways emboldened me, I think, because um I don't know, because it struck me, it was one of the first times that like what I was doing was so powerful that someone, or so disruptive in whatever way, that people felt like they had to stop it. They had to stop it in its tracks, not just like punish me for it or have a conversation with me for it afterwards, but I could not be allowed to finish that thing. And honestly, that was like sort of intoxicating for me. Um, which I don't know what that says about me, but yeah, I mean, certainly there have been times when I've like either been asked to not read either a poem or a poem that includes certain things for all kinds of reasons, right? Like, if I'm reading at a school, for example, like a middle school, I'm probably not going to read the poems with a bunch of cuss words, just because like I don't know, because I have a broad sense that middle school students probably would love that, but like, that it wouldn't be welcomed by the adults in the space, and I'm like, not trying to be disrespectful of the space in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, right, on why the request comes, but rarely do I get like a request to not read a specific poem that feels really like icky or really like off base for me. Because honestly, I think like if you didn't, I don't know, like if you've read like either of my books, any of my work, like with any length, you kind of get a sense of like the things that I'm concerned with, the things I'm talking about, thinking through. And if you don't, if you're like uncomfortable with those issues, then you just wouldn't invite me to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I don't think I'm the sort of poet like who could be mistaken as like, oh yes, he writes those like lovely, nice, poems for children or like love poems, or like I'm not like a raw doll or whatever, where I have like a very sort of pristine, like sort of sacred side, and then there's like the other stuff. Like I'm kind of myself in all the spaces, even when obviously like there are times when you're not gonna say certain things because I don't know, you're a person in the world, and that's how you relate to people.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for sure. I was listening to an interview with you on NPR talking about talking about uh you getting jumped, and
Mhm.
and right when it was over and you got home, you were like, this is gonna make a good poem.
Yeah, yeah, no, dead ass. Yeah.
um, can you talk about where you grew up? Can you talk about growing up in Roseland and how it
Sure.
shaped your approach to writing poetry?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up on the far south side, kind of right in between like Roseland, Morgan Park, and West Pullman, right at like 116th, just west of Halsted, for folks who know that part of the city. Um, I think it did a lot of things for me, right? In terms of, so certainly, right, like I'm coming of age really like in the 90s and the 2000s. And so that means a number of things were happening, right? Like one, in the, like, my earliest memories are in part like, are really happening in this moment at which I have an older sister who's a teenager at this point in like the mid 90s. And this is like really one of the high points of violence, especially violence affecting like young people in the city, in history, right? And so I'm seeing that, right? Those as like a foundational part of my life, right? In my community, right? It's like seeing my like 15, 16-year-old sister like going to funerals
Mm.
and like wearing RIP t-shirts and all this kind of stuff. Um, beginning to understand like the presence of things like gang culture, et cetera, et cetera. And that was impactful for me. But the other thing I'll also say that I really saw too was, um, it was complicated, right? Like I think things resisted easy explanation, right? Because I think it's very easy, for example, like in the, our mayor does this a lot where she's often like in very uncritical ways that lack a deep amount of nuance, talking about people as like good people or bad people. These are terrible gang members who do awful things, and these are valiant cops who do whatever. And like that's just not actually how society works or how communities exist. And so like one thing for me I always think about is like when I was young, it was largely like a lot of the OGs and a lot of the people who would be criminalized, right? And who like did complicated and sometimes awful things, who made a lot of space for me in the neighborhood, right?
Mm.
Who were like, we don't like Nate is good, like Nathaniel, he cool. That's John Cornette little brother. Like he just be going to school and shit. Like y'all leave him alone, right? And I don't think that people think about that, like think about like um that kids like that were making space for kids like a me. Um and and so that was a thing that I think always struck me. And I think it also how can I say? It just struck me that like people really are interconnected. Like people are really in relationship with each other, whether or not they're aware of it. And so that's like a thing I'm always trying to be mindful of and always trying to hold in all the sort of complicated ways that it exists.
Mhm.
Yeah. Cause like even I remember like, to go to the NPR interview that you talked about. Like I remember when that happened, um, it was these like four guys who jumped on me when I was like getting off the bus coming from high school. And I didn't know them. They weren't from my part of the neighborhood. You know, I'm not certain I've ever seen them again, right? Like if I saw them on the street today, I wouldn't know. But I certainly like, you know, it was not lost on me that despite this sort of transgression that they had visited upon me, and despite like, whatever antagonism existed there, one, that like them jumping on me was like deeply not personal.
Mm.
Two, that them jumping on me was like unpleasant for everyone involved, including them.
Of course.
And three, that even though these were not men that I knew or like had, or young men that I knew or like had a direct touch to in that way, um, we were absolutely sort of connected, um, by virtue of a lot, by virtue of a lot of things, right? And to be frank, like right, like One of the things that really struck me is when, like, my mom called the police after that, and they came to our house. And maybe I'll read a poem next, is sort of about that moment. But like, that the police were more or less like only prepared to see me, basically in a very similar way that they would see those young men. And so, even just by virtue of that, whether I wanted it or not, whether I was comfortable with it or not, um, you know, me and them were governed by the same limits of perception as each other. Um, and whether I was, the person jumping on someone or being jumped on was kind of immaterial, right? Is that, like, in many ways, the police, even when I was calling them, were like pretty prepared to see me as a sort of criminal or potential criminal figure. Because that's what happens when you like create stories that have no nuance, right? Is one, you think people are, you build these bright red lines for people and who they are and who they are not, yeah, maybe I'll read that poem.
Okay.
So this poem is called "Let Me Put It to You Like This, Fam." Another one I don't read a lot. Let me put it to you like this, fam. Terrorists are thugs, our freedom fighters, our police, our gang members, our cousins, our politicians, our teachers, our prosecutors, our love, our loathing, depending on your vantage point. Like the time them guys jumped me and tried to run my pockets, they were frantic and afraid. And I could tell because of the shallow, quick kicks they offered to my skinny body. I think they meant to rob me, but they ran their hands into the wrong pocket first because I'm left-handed. So in a sense, writing didn't save my life, but it did keep my few dollars and my bus card from disappearing. Oh, writing, the savior of my state ID. These dudes were about the same size as me, but they were four and I a single me. And when they got off the bus at my stop, I noticed they wore all the name brands we loved but can't remember now. My gear was anonymous and dark like our faces. I was just a hoodie and a surprising punch back. These days, I think about how they slipped my knees from behind and had all the leverage to stomp whatever part of me and didn't. Bless them. Praise the day I became a polytheist. Praise my four gods, and I pray for my four gods as often as I pray for myself. Praise the gods they find or will find or who have found them in churches and parties and coffins and corner stores. I'm saying this. Cats could really end a mug if they had better aim or worse aim, depending on your vantage point. It's like bad meaning bad or bad meaning good. I mean, it's like not believing in police because you don't believe in police when they sit in your mama's house and tell her nothing can be done because they don't do things really. It's like believing in gangs because of the past they gave you, the strong dap and safe haven to go on being bookish and breathing and walking in the hood. Let me put it to you like this, fam. Who you believe in is a matter of who you matter to.
Wow. Oof. Yeah, it's literally that. Like, let's have a moment. Let's have a moment. Thank you. Thank you for that. What piece of literature has had the most profound effect on you as a writer? Which is probably a crazy question because I know that you read a lot. You're an educator. But humor me.
Damn, yeah, that's a bit. Oh man, wow. So I want to name a bunch of things, but now I kind of want to name one thing just as like with deference to the question and to the like obvious kind of impossibility of the question. Let me think about that. Okay, I'll say this is one, and some of it is about the piece of writing or the pieces of writing, and some of it I think is about like the broader context. But I was just talking about this to friends the other day. When I was in undergrad, I had the opportunity to study abroad at the University of Cape Town in South Africa,
Wow.
um, which was really kind of a life-changing experience. But one of the things, so a few things, right? One, I'll say like I've always been like relatively good at school. I like sort of school, like school has kind of rules and structures that for me that I just like intuitively understand relatively well. And so like I've always done pretty good at it, you know, which is like a helpful skill to have if one is like, you know, any kid I imagine, and certainly like, a working class Black kid. That's like a useful like skill. But I would say I was never really like a diligent student. I was never a particularly diligent or dedicated student. I was just like, I just had like some natural inclination and I knew how to play the game. And the University of Cape Town, in a lot of ways, I think grew me up, right? Like I really came back sort of a different person. And one of the things that I did when I was there was I read like all of James Baldwin's Price of the Ticket, his like collected nonfiction joint. So I couldn't, the way they had it in the library, and I was the first time I'd ever really seen a copy of that, right? Like I had maybe read The Fire Next Time and I'd read Go Tell It on the Mountain, but I hadn't read a ton of Baldwin. But I knew who he was and like had a sense of his kind of stature. And so I found that big collected, and I'm like, well, cool, I'm gonna just ride with this. And I would go to the library like 3 or 4 times a week for a few hours and just sit with the copy. You couldn't even check it out of the library because it's an out of print book. It's like relatively rare. It's like a relatively expensive book. Like you probably can't buy that book in anywhere for like less than a few $100s, right? And so I would just sit there and like read that book um, for like as many hours as I could stand, like all the days I didn't have class, and only had class maybe like 2 or 3 days a week. And the study of that language, right? The study of like thinking about how Baldwin was using language, was like sort of crafting song in like alongside crafting thought, I think was really transformational to me. And also like feeling out the places where I really agreed with Baldwin, where I disagreed with Baldwin or thought that his vantage point was naive or sort of limited,
Mm.
right? Um, I think all those things like it really had a really profound impact on me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that you know yourself in that way and even knew yourself so well then that you'll be like, I disagree with you, James,
Mm-hmm.
on this.
Well,
Um,
yeah. I mean, it happens, right? Like, I think it's like we can have heroes or we can have like people we admire, but like not so much so that we don't, I don't want to believe that anybody can't be wrong, myself included, right? Um, yeah, so I don't know. I do like to like read into the disagreement in some ways.
yeah, I like that. What advice do you have for someone who is thinking about or wants to be a poet?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think the biggest advice I say like is to just do it, right? Just like, you know, like if you want to write, like take your pen to the page and like don't be afraid to write poorly. Because I think a lot of times like people get hung up. That's where people will get hung up is like they're afraid to write bad things. But I'm like most of the things that I've ever written at least start off as bad things and maybe become okay over time. But you kind of have to throw clay. Like I think in many ways like poetry is as much sculpting as anything, and you need material to work from.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so that'd be my biggest advice is just like and read and read things that you think you'll love or that you love, and read things that you also think you might hate, because you'll be surprised. And I think when you really become a smart reader, you become able to find the utility in work even that you deeply disagree with, or that deeply does not resonate with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Do you have one more for us, maybe?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'll do one more. Let us see. All right, so I will do this one. You don't need to know nothing. This poem is called Fit 11. How much is owed to those who wore the chains, who tilled the land, who nursed the babes, who mixed the grits, who fried the food, who chopped the wood, who picked the bowls, who ran the road, who fought the war, who shared the crop, who made the name, who wore the noose, who blacked the codes, who sparked the schools, who juked the blues, who showed the soul, who left the South, who stayed the course, who caught the hell, who marched the march, who broke the strike, who struck the blow, who took the vote, who held the hood, who housed the club, who queered the notes, who spun the jams, who funked the flow, who built the thing, who built the thing, who built the thing. You know, take the payment you ain't give for all that and press it down, make it overflow, fit 11 times and give me that in my own numbers of my own currency. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roy. Yeah, thank you to all the organizers, to all the sponsors. Of course, like the library and Poetry Magazine, whatever. Like, shout out to everybody.
You know, you're a favorite. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nate Marshall, for being incredible, being brilliant, being a comedian, a wonderful writer, a young heartthrob, out here contributing to our canon. But most of all, of course, for being our 22nd annual Poetry Fest keynote poet. We really, really appreciate you. Thank you. You know, you are our favorites, a beloved of the Chicago Public Library. This video, for everybody, it will be up on the CPL's YouTube and Facebook page. Thank you so much for, from the bottom of my heart and from Chicago Public Library. We are so blessed to have you, to know you, to celebrate with you, and to celebrate you for Poetry Month. So thank you so much. My favorite Libra, my favorite Chicago.
Thank you.
It's Nate Marshall. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. My name is Roy Kinsey. Happy National Poetry Month. We'll see you next time. Peace.